Cooperative compensation or not? What does that mean? Hello, my name is Michael Cheever. I've been in real estate for 23 years and had the opportunity to go from starting off at zero to over 500 million in closed transactions. And I currently am thankful for the opportunity to serve as the general manager of the Rawls Group. Cooperative compensation or not? Let's just talk about compensation in general on the buyer side when the seller decides that they're going to offer it. So it can be cooperative, which means it goes through the listing broker to the buyer's broker, or it could go from the seller directly to the buyer's broker. In either case, it is an incentive that the seller offers to the buyer, whereby the seller is covering some or all of the compensation that a buyer would pay to their buyer's agent. In this scenario, the seller has three options. One is they're offering it and they want it publicly known to buyers and buyers agents that they are offering it. The second is that they're willing to consider it, but it has to be with an acceptable offer. So they want to see offers and then decide if they're going to make that incentive available. And then the third is that they are not willing to consider it under any circumstances. So option number three is really pretty straightforward. There's really nothing to communicate around cooperative or incentive compensation to a buyer's agent or a buyer because the seller's not willing to consider it. So let's talk about options 1 and 2. One is that the seller is offering it and that they want you as their listing broker to communicate that to buyers and to buyer's agents. Well, in that scenario, we're going to talk about two things. How do I communicate it? And another question that I'm starting to get is, do I have to communicate it, right? Well, the answer is yes. If your seller says, I want this communicated, you have to communicate it. I'd like you to think about this in a little different way. There was something that started showing up about a decade ago in listings, and it was in the private remarks, and there's a reason it was in the private remarks. What it was that started showing up is a listing agent would say, if I show your buyer this property, then the compensation that I'm offering, cooperative compensation that I'm offering, will be reduced. Let's say it was 3%, they were reducing it to 1. If they were offering 2%, they were reducing it to 1. So in effect, what they were saying to the market is they were telling buyers agents, hey, you're gonna be penalized if I show this property to the buyer. And that's fine if they were disclosing that to their seller up front and their seller said, yes, I'm okay with it. So in effect, what the seller was saying is, I want to make this incentive available and I want you to market it. And what this listing agent was doing is the listing agent was discounting the incentive that the seller was offering so that they could keep more as the listing agent. But they weren't telling the seller. So coming back to what we're talking about here, if the seller instructs you that they are offering compensation as an incentive and you don't let buyers and buyers agents know, you're in effect doing the same thing, which is you're not following your seller's instructions relative to what they've asked you to do. And I believe that you're opening yourself up to liability on that. Now let's get into number 2, which this one's a little more interesting. So number 2 is I'm willing to consider it with an acceptable offer, meaning the seller is willing to consider compensation to the buyer side. What some agents are doing right now is they're just kind of opening it up and they're saying, hey, regardless of whether my seller is offering it or isn't offering it, or option 2, they're considering it with an offer, I'm just going to go out there and say, hey, submit offers and we'll let you know what the seller decides. Well, here's the problem with this. The problem with this is that if your seller has given you clear direction, they will or will not consider it, and you're playing in the middle there with make me an offer, I'll submit it to the seller and see what they say, you're going against your seller's instructions, which is I expect you to communicate that I am offering it and here's how much, or I expect you to say I am not offering it and I will not consider it. So just be careful in how you're consulting with your clients up front in listing consultations. Make sure that you're explaining their options to them, that you're clear in what their directions are, and that you're following their directions, obviously in a compliant way. So what is that compliant way? Well, there's really two options that are viewed currently as very safe. Number one is in the private remarks, you instruct agents to text, email or call you for offer instructions. When they do that, you respond back with the documentation and the forms that your seller has signed and authorized. And those can also include regular offer instructions, the pre-show and compensation agreement, seller's property disclosure, community disclosure, information like that. Number two is you can go through what we call double click. Now, this double click thing is currently viewed again as acceptable. Stay on top of this as we evolve. 2 clicks means I am putting into private remarks a link for you to click for offer instruction. When they click there, they go to another website, a link that you've created, and you have directions for them to click here for cooperative compensation on my listings or seller compensation on my listings. Remember, this is your website or this can be your broker's website. Once you get outside of that, there can be some question marks. Question number 1, do I have to have a signed buyer brokerage agreement for buyers who come into my open house? And the answer is no. If you are acting in the capacity of representing a seller on your listing, then you're not representing those buyers by them seeing the property. You're acting in the capacity where you're representing your client who is the seller. It's the same thing if you're hosting an open house for a listing that your broker has. Even if it might not be your listing, maybe you're hosting that for another agent at your brokerage. If you're acting in the capacity of working for the seller, which in that situation you are, then you do not have to have buyers who come to view that property sign a buyer brokerage agreement. Now, if you start working with one of those buyers and you're showing them other properties, then at that point, before you show those properties, you would have to have a buyer brokerage agreement signed. Crush it. We're stronger together.